While Blizzard made the questionable decision to drop Mop Classic just 2 weeks before a new retail season, we know that a lot of you are still dedicated to the War Within grind, and we definitely respect it. And while there will definitely be some chaos in the coming weeks, we've decided to help you out by taking a deeper dive into the most important changes for every class, including how they will affect your playstyle in PvP. Now, one thing you need to immediately know no matter what spec you play is that tier sets are now based on your hero talents. That's right, your bonus will change based on your class and hero specialization. We will discuss this in detail later on when tier sets become relevant in a few weeks, but no matter what, if you want to get ahead in the early season, skillcap.com is the only place that guarantees you can gain at least 400 rating by using all of our amazing services, which applies to all of our games covered under one subscription. We've even leveled up our add-on for Season 3, giving you a game-changing UI in a matter of seconds, which now includes 2-in-1 support for PvE and covers every single class. We've also got hundreds of insane guides designed to instantly get you ahead of the competition, including positioning videos and courses on how to counter every spec in PvP. The gap between players is growing faster than ever, and if you want to get ahead of everyone else, be sure to click the links below. But now let's get into it by looking at Death Knight in Season 3, which is finally getting a massive rework. Well, kinda. There is definitely some good news we will talk about, but first some bad. AMZ is now worse, having a shorter baseline duration and reducing less overall damage. DK utility was already a bit questionable, so this definitely hurts. Abomination Limb was also removed from the class tree and was reworked into a new unholy talent called Legion of Souls, but more on that later. If you play Frost DK, then Deathbringer might be back on the table as Reaper's Mark received a pretty juicy damage buff. Deathbringer also got a buff to the Bind in Darkness talent, which will make Howling Blast damage far more relevant when playing this hero spec. And one big change is that Cleaving Strikes no longer, well, cleaves. But not to worry for all you Frost DK AoE enjoyers, because Frost Strike has a few talents allowing it to AoE, so it's quite possible that the general playstyle of Frost DK won't really be changing this patch. You're still going to deal extremely high pressure during Pillar of Frost, trying to 3-2-1 setup kills with your partners. Unholy also received a complete rework of its talent tree, but it probably won't change the general playstyle of the spec for most players. Most of the changes centered around consolidating talents and making things a bit more passive, but the playstyle is still the same. One key quality of life improvement is that you now get both Plaguebringer and Clawing Shadows now, so you don't have to make the choice between AoE and single target damage profiles with these two talents. Instead, the real decision will be choosing Raise Abomination or Legion of Souls, which is what Abomination Limb turned into. Raise Abomination will likely be better for single target pressure and is historically the main win condition of the spec, but Legion of Souls could be better in situations where you want to pad the meters. And even though Sand Lane got a bit of a rework, we still expect Rider of the Apocalypse to be the primary hero spec since it is far less restricted by uptime. Overall, neither DK spec will feel that much different compared to Season 2, and we are still worried about more structural issues when it comes to Arena, like the fact that DK still seems susceptible to getting bullied by other melee. But was there any good news for Demon Hunter in the patch? Turns out there were literally zero changes to Havoc. But don't worry, because in case you've been out of the loop, DH was easily the best melee last season thanks to having some incredible damage output on top of solid control and a well-rounded defensive kit. And even though they are nerfed in PvP, DH has one of the best tier sets this season for Alrachi Reaver, so expect a huge power spike from this spec a few weeks into the season. But how are Druids looking in Season 3? Let's look at some of the most important class changes first. Lykara's Teachings was reworked and now provides passive bonuses. While this talent wasn't that useful in PvP, it is definitely more playable. But unfortunately for all you Feral and Resto mains, Maim received a cooldown increase to 30 seconds, which now matches Kidney Shot. If you play Boomkin, you should be happy to hear that Balance got a flat 8% damage buff twice in a row thanks to some last-minute changes, which really sticks to the trend of Boomy somehow becoming one of the best casters at the end of every expansion every time. This is a spec that was already looking good at the end of Season 2, performing super well with Rogues and Demon Hunters in 3v3, and being very competitive in Solo Shuffle despite some survivability issues in the early expansion. Feral originally got a flat 8% damage buff, which was unfortunately reverted and was compensated by some last-minute tuning. No matter what, the spec will be a bit more punishing to play after the Maim nerf. As for Resto Druids, the spec received a buff to Tranquility and will benefit from some additional buffs to Wild Stalker healing, which was already the main hero spec in Season 2. And to really cement this even further, they also made Wild Stalker's implant effect trigger from Wild Growth instead of just Swift Mend, which potentially means that you could be pressing this heal more often in Arena as long as mana isn't an issue. Now, for all of you Evokers out there, 11.2 introduced one huge change. Nullifying Shroud was completely redesigned, and now triggers as a temporary 4-second buff after Verdant Embrace is pressed, which essentially gives it the same functionality as a Priest's Fade. This change is interesting since on paper it is a huge buff against specs with Dispels and spammable CC, but will make the early game a bit more volatile into other classes. As far as each Evoker spec is concerned, Augmentation walked away with a flat 5% damage buff. If you played during Season 2, there was a brief period where Aug was absolutely busted, but eventually fell off after some nerfs later on. Devastation was generally more played throughout the entire season, and was one of those specs which was kinda sleeper OP. Dev was on the receiving end of some flat damage increases, as well as a mini rework to the Flame Shaper hero spec, which is the true gimmicky one-shot option. Overall though, we expect Devastation to be really solid this season, especially after the Nullifying Shroud change. It will continue to bully melee while being relatively tanky with super high consistent damage. As far as Preservation is concerned, there are a lot of changes here, including some healing nerfs. But not to worry, because there is one very important talent change that stands out. Just in Time was redesigned, and now reduces time dilation's cooldown by 10 seconds, and more importantly, grants an additional charge. We saw Disc Priests get a similar talent charge back in Dragonflight, which quickly made them one of the best healers. In any case, it's hard to predict how these changes will pan out for Evoker. At the end of last season, it was definitely one of the better healers in Solo Shuffle, but felt a bit lobby dependent. The Nullifying Shroud change will definitely have a huge impact on their balance this season, and might help solve some issues against Mages and Druids. But what is the fate of Hunters in Season 3? This is another class with huge changes. Hunters weren't great in 3s last season, but solid in Shuffle. Across the board, every hero spec is getting some changes, especially Dark Ranger, which could now be a more appealing option for BM Hunters thanks to a mastery change, but more on that later. As for Pack Leader, one very important change includes a buff to Shell Cover, which was previously a weak passive defensive, but now offers up to 35% damage reduction, which is quite substantial. And even though Sentinel only got one change, it's really important, since Lunar Storm will no longer become disjointed with Rapid Fire. This is a massive quality of life improvement and damage increased package into one, which will likely benefit marksmanship hunters the most. Now, to focus on each spec individually, BM is getting a lot of changes, but we expect gameplay to feel largely the same. With that said, one very important change was the redesign to their mastery, which now offers an additional benefit to the damage of the hunter instead of just the pet. This is why Dark Ranger might be more appealing as BM this patch, as now you have an additional modifier on Black Arrow. Marksmanship is also getting a bunch of changes, with most being focused on quality of life improvements, especially with Lock and Load. Finally, Survival is looking really good, especially with a 50% buff to the initial damage to Wildfire Bomb and other buffs to Explosive Shot on top of a few redesigned talents. Both Born to Kill and Cull the Herd will be pumping more damage into Kill Shot. The TLDR here is that Survival Hunter should be doing considerably more damage this patch and will likely be one of the better specs in the early season. Moving on, let's take a look at what to expect for Mages in Season 3. First, the good news. Every Mage spec got a slight damage increase thanks to a buff to Inspired Intellect. But unfortunately, this came with the complete removal of Time Anomaly, which was one of the strongest talents in the entire game. Going through each spec one by one, Arcane was on the receiving end of a 3% overall damage buff, along with some buffs to Mastery, which isn't a stat you typically stack in PvP, but could become relevant once you get enough haste with this season's gear. And someone call Mitch Jones, because Arcane also got a new gimmicky one-shot PvP talent called Netherflux, which was really broken in the preseason due to an interaction with last season's tier set. Blizzard eventually nerfed this talent, so it's a bit unclear what the playstyle will look like for the spec going forward. Things are also looking exciting for all of you Fire Mage fans, as Frostfire, Bolt, Pyro, and Meteor all got damage buffs. We know it's been a while since Fire has been the meta spec for mages, but this could potentially be the tipping point that makes it way more competitive. Your win condition will likely be the same, being the most aggressive mage spec centered around bursting targets down with Meteor. Obviously, Frost was one of the god specs last season and almost got a 10% damage buff, which was reverted after some last-minute changes. This is a spec we think will continue to perform well in both Solo Shuffle and 3v3, even with the removal of Time Anomaly. In any case, no matter what spec you want to play, Mage is looking really solid this season. But what about monks? Well, things might be a little bit tricky for Mistweaver. While the spec is getting a buff to Revival and Shaylun's Gift, there is one super annoying change in the patch notes that affects every monk spec, but especially Mistweaver. Vivacious Vivication was completely redesigned, and now procs after using Rising Sun Kick instead of proccing automatically. This is one of those changes that reinforces the Fistweaver playstyle with PvE in mind. It's probably going to be more annoying for caster monks who don't always have the luxury to push in and kick someone in the face. Monks were already susceptible to spammable CC, and this change definitely doesn't help. Overall, Mistweaver Monk will continue to be a relatively polarizing healer, especially in solo shuffle. In some lobbies, it will have insanely high impact over the game, but in others, might feel completely countered. As for you Windwalker monks, there are 0 relevant changes for PvP. While Windwalker wasn't the best spec in Season 2, it was far from the worst, but with huge buffs to everyone else, you might feel relatively weaker at the start of the season. Moving on, let's take a look at the fate of Paladins in 11.2. First up, there were some class-wide changes to Herald of the Sun, which will affect Holy the most considering there is a 15% buff to Eternal Flame and a 40% buff to Sun's Avatar. Infusion of Light was also redesigned to now proc off of random Holy shot casts instead of just crits. Now, in case you've been out of the loop, Holy Pallies were definitely one of the best healers at the end of Season 2, especially in 3v3. 11.2 also introduces multiple buffs to the spec, many of which do not affect PvP, but still include increases to Holy Light healing and stronger Flash of Light healing potential. Because of this, we expect Holy Paladin to be one of the better healers in the early season in every single bracket. And as far as Red is concerned, this is a spec with a massive list of damage buffs this patch, most notably to Wake of Ashes, Templar's Verdict, and Judgment. That's right, many core rotational spells are going to be hitting much harder. Ret was already doing exceptionally well last season in solo shuffle. While it was historically considered lobby dependent, the spec did perform well in both regions. 3v3 was a different story, however, and Ret was definitely much worse compared to other melee specs, especially Warrior and DH. In any case, we expect Rets to have a very strong start to Season 3, potentially being one of the best overall melee, especially in solo shuffle. Next up, let's take a look at Priest in Season 3. First up, we have a bunch of mana changes to Discipline and Holy, which we will explain in just a second, but we should also note that Ultimate Penitence was buffed by 35%. Despite not being the best healer last season, Disc was still insanely popular, and with these changes, we don't really expect their playstyle or relative power level to change by all that much. It will continue to be a tempo-based healer, with Oracle continuing to be the primary hero spec in solo shuffle and 3v3. As far as Holy is concerned, outside of a buff to Divine Hymn, there are only a few mana cost changes, with tons of rotational spells getting reduced mana costs and Surge of Light and Apotheosis giving less mana benefits. The culprit here is a combination of PvE balance and this season's tier set, specifically for Archon, which gives tons of Surge of Light procs with Halo. Shadow is where things get a bit more interesting, as there are now multiple new talent options on top of redesigns to existing talents and node swaps throughout the entire tree. These changes come with buffs to multiple damage spells and an additional charge to Shadow Crash, which is a massive quality of life improvement. One of the new talents added this patch is Void Volley, which was previously the name of a PvP talent that is now called Cascading Horrors. It's kinda confusing, but this new Void Volley seems a bit promising, as if it gives you an additional burst spell after you press Void Torrent, dealing 10 hits of damage in a short period of time. While SP wasn't that great in 3v3, the spec was a bit sleeper in solo shuffle, with the ability to do well in a wide variety of lobbies. The biggest hurdle faced by the spec was melee cleaves, but with the buff to Shadow Crash, we think that the spec might excel in Season 3. Then when it comes to rogues, there's a lot of great news, depending on the spec you play. Assassination saw a massive list of damage buffs, including a 12% overall damage increase, which were slightly offset by a last-minute nerf to Garrett. For the uninitiated, Asa was one of the better melee specs in solo shuffle last season, despite being a bit volatile. Even though it might have had tough matches into Paladins, the spec was very dominant in caster lobbies and had the ability to end games quickly thanks to unhealable AoE damage. If anything, these buffs in 11.2 will simply solidify Assassination as one of the best melee in the bracket. And as far as Outlaw is concerned, this was definitely one of the weakest specs in the game, due in part to having much weaker damage output compared to other melee. Not to worry though, since 11.2 introduced a flat 13% damage increase on top of a redesign to Killing Spree, which now deals significantly more damage. It's hard to predict exactly how strong Outlaw will be this season, but one thing is certain, that it will definitely be at least one tier higher compared to last patch. Finally, when it comes to Sub-Rogue, there aren't any meaningful changes in PvP, which isn't exactly a bad thing. Sub was one of the best melee in the game in every single bracket, doing exceptionally well in solo shuffle, 3v3, and 2v2. It will continue to be incredibly rewarding for any experienced player who knows how to carve out win conditions on their own. But now let's take a look at what's to come for all three Shaman specs heading into Season 3. While many of the damage buffs to Ellie don't apply to PvP, there is one key change to the Farseer hero spec hidden in the patch notes. Elemental Reverb now increases lava burst damage by 20% up from 5, which represents a 15% overall damage increase to your primary damage spell. This comes with a buff to Maelstrom's Supremacy, which increases the damage of Earthshock by an additional 10%. Ellie was already one of the best casters in the game, especially in 3v3 where it synergized well with Holy Paladins and any Flavor of the Month melee. With these damage changes alone, we fully expect it to be one of the best casters in the game in this bracket, along with Solo Shuffle, where it will continue to be relatively neutral in most lobbies. As far as enhancement is concerned, the spec got a quality of life improvement to Thorum's Invocation and some back-to-back last-minute damage buffs. This was a spec that is historically clunky. It's incredibly comp dependent in 3v3 and is a bit weaker compared to other melee and solo shuffle. It's one of those specs that really needs to be overtuned in order to do well. If you can't do big damn, you can't win. No pun intended. Unfortunately for Resto, there's only one change with a buff to Healing Tide Totem, which aligns with the buff to every other healer's big AoE spell. Resto Shaman was arguably the worst healer in the game last season in every single bracket, and with other healers receiving buffs, we don't expect their relative strength to increase at all. Moving on, let's take a look at what's happening to Warlocks in Season 3. First up, we have a massive quality of life improvement for Demo and Destro, as now Corruption is instant cast and deals damage on application. What this means is that these specs now have a very convenient way to kill Grounding Totem or tag an enemy Druid or Rogue to prevent a re-stealth. Then when it comes to unique spec changes, unfortunately, many of the damage buffs to Affliction do not affect PvP combat. With that said, there was one PvP specific change buffing the damage of UA by 35%, which should help offset the loss of last season's tier set, which was exceptionally strong in PvP. Affliction was one of those specs which struggled a bit last season, especially early on when warriors were extremely dominant. While it did have some decent comps in 3v3, we think the spec might struggle early in 11.2, especially considering that warriors were once again buffed, but more on that later. Now, as far as Demo is concerned, there were a lot of changes in the patch, including an overall damage decrease, which was offset by buffs to individual spells, including Shadow Bolt, Wild Imps, Tyrant, and Vile Fiend. But more importantly, Master Summoner was moved from a PvP talent to a baseline talent on the Demonology tree. Having an extra PvP talent slot is always a good thing, and we expect Demo to be one of those sleeper OP specs in Season 3. Demonology always seems to do exceptionally well in caster-heavy lobbies thanks to having an MS effect, and can even do well when playing with other melee. Then when it comes to Destro, there were very few changes that impacted PvP outside of some small hero talent damage buffs. Not to worry though, since Destruction was arguably the best Warlock spec in PvP last season. Even though the class as a whole had a rough start to the patch, Destro balanced out towards the end of the season and was really good in 3v3 and Solo Shuffle, where it had a really consistent win condition with Double Coil Chaos Bolt. Finally, let's take a look at what's shaping up for Warriors in the final season of The War Within. First up, there was one quality of life improvement to the class as a whole, with a reduction to the GCD of Hamstring. Then, as far as each spec is concerned, both Arms and Fury received a flat 5% damage increase, on top of a 15% buff to Bladestorm damage. If you haven't played in a while, Arms was arguably the second best melee in the game at the end of the last season in 3v3, having some extremely dominant comps while also being really solid in Solo Shuffle, where it was relatively lobby neutral. If you're wondering why, it's because of two words: big damage. Arms got a ton of damage buffs going into Season 2, which definitely helped carry the spec despite some nerfs later on. In any case, a 5% buff is definitely a good thing, and we expect Arms to be the premier warrior spec in Season 3. Alright, so what do we think about the future of PvP? Well, it seems like the 11.2 class changes feel like Blizzard is donating buffs left and right, even to overperforming specs. As always, we expect the early season to feel a bit chaotic, and there should be regular class tuning every week. We're going to warn you though, knowledge continues to create a growing gap between players, and there is so much information you will still need to track. That's why our courses are so insanely OP for gaining rating, because they close this gap by teaching you the fundamentals needed to actually reach your potential. Whether it's role-specific tips, positioning, or guides on how to counter every class, we've got you covered. And now, Skill Cap members get full access to the #1 UI in PvP, built from the ground up to make sure you have a unique advantage over your opponents. And no matter what, we will back you up with a rating gain guarantee, where we promise that you will see rating gains while actively using our website. We even offer a 14-day, no questions asked money-back guarantee for those of you who just want to try us out. So after this video, be sure to click the link below for an exclusive discount to get started. That's going to be all for us here today, though. We'll catch you in the next one.